Hello, good morning. I want to start by thanking the conference organisers for all their hard work in setting up this really exciting and fascinating event, and especially for inviting me to come and talk here today. 2015 sees a series of national events celebrating the lives of women and work of women photographers. These include the wonderful exhibition which I visited yesterday at the Media Space, which marks the bicentenary of the birth of Julie Margaret Cameron, seen here on the left, and the V&A's forthcoming exhibition, which marks the 150th anniversary of her first exhibition at the South Kensington Museum. Today, I want to talk about a project which involves two Birmingham photographers, Emma Barton, who you can see in the centre, and Marta Kochanek on the right, who each in their own way has been inspired by Mrs. Cameron and her work, and who all in different kind of ways worked in the commercial sector. I should say at the outset that this is not a kind of a formal academic paper like most of those being presented today at the conference. It's perhaps more of a presentation about a series of ideas forming around what might be what Liz Wells described yesterday as an action project. And it's slowly evolving into a more distinct and structured form. I do wonder sometimes whether I've created or beginning to create some kind of complex hybrid monster, which I can't quite get my head around, but maybe you'll be able to tell me about that a bit later on. At its heart, what the project I hope will seek to do will, in one sense, explore what it means to revisit a photographic archive and a project which I did 20 years ago, to find new ways of re-engaging and reanimating the archives of women photographers, and in so doing to rekindle interest in their work and stimulate new activity around their work, which can be used as learning tools for photographers trying to enter the photographic profession as we go forward. So the central idea is to explore, compare and contrast the personal and professional journeys which Emma Barton and Marta Kochanek took in order to become established in the photographic industry. The first, Emma's, was a journey of social migration, and the other, Marta's, was a journey of geographical migration. Both journeys were underpinned by common themes: ambition, artistic vision, enterprise, determination, and tenacity, and a willingness to overcome all the challenges and obstacles that were placed in their path. It's a project which, in exploring these shifting perspectives, might eventually tell us something about the different ways in which women have become involved in kind of commercial photography, and how much, or perhaps how little, has changed for women seeking to establish themselves as careers in photographic industry during the last century. The project also aims to facilitate the creation of new work, to create a series of exhibition and learning outcomes, to animate photography archives, and perhaps most critically, to develop and share the knowledge gained in the process of the project in ways which will inspire and inform those seeking to establish themselves in today's photographic industry. And I don't just mean those making work. I'm also thinking about photographers, researchers, curators, and gallerists. I'm also thinking about myself in this, and I'm currently in the process of kind of reinventing my role as a kind of a freelance. I want to emphasize at the start that this is currently very much at the research and development stage. The ideas around the project are evolving all the time, some of them as late as 4:30 this morning when I had an idea which I had to get up and kind of note down before I forgot it. I did get back to sleep for a couple of hours. The project clearly has a very distinct Birmingham focus, but what I would hope is we could possibly develop a more universal model in which the learning outcomes which evolve from it could be applied elsewhere and developed elsewhere a bit further down the line. We certainly hope, or I would certainly hope, that the project will gain some impetus as a result of the ideas and information shared at this conference, and there was certainly a huge amount of food for thought in yesterday's sessions and in the two papers this morning. The project, in many senses, has its roots in the pioneering work of Val Williams, and in particular her book, The Other Observers, first published by Virago in 1986. Reading it shortly after beginning work at the Library of Birmingham, or the Birmingham Central Library as it was then in 1990, galvanized me into research for accounts of the work of women photographers in Birmingham and their presence, or as it turned out, their absence, of their work in the archives in the library. The search led me to rediscover the work of Mrs. G.A., or kind of Emma Barton. So these are portraits of Emma Barton. On the left is one of the earliest known portraits of her, probably taken in the late 1980s. The middle one is a self-portrait, kind of Madonna image, and the last image is around about 1935, when she pretty much retired and moved to a house on the Isle of Wight. So in 1990, I began a 4-year research project, which, working in collaboration with the oral historian Pam Taylor, Pam Roberts, then curator of photographs at the Royal Photographic Society, and Tessa Saidi, curator of fine art at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, amongst others, eventually traced material by Emma Barton dispersed in private and public collections in the UK, Southern Africa, and Australia. It also led to meetings and interviews with Mrs. Barton's granddaughters, 2 sisters who featured in some of Mrs. Barton's later photographs, and who, along with other members of the family, held archives of memories, images, and objects relating to their once famous grandmother. The completed research, or what we then thought was the completed research, enabled us to compile what we then thought to be a list of all the prints made by Emma Barton in public collections, most of the articles published about and referring to her work in British, European, and American photographic journals, all the traceable reproductions of her work across a range of publications, including The Sphere, Country Life, Photography, Photograms of the Year, the Royal Photographic Society annual exhibition catalogues, and in publications including Girls' Own Annual. The research revealed a story of a remarkable and tenacious woman who, having been born into a working-class family in Birmingham, set about an amazing journey in the late 19th century, which saw her move into the middle classes, marry a solicitor, raise a family of 3 girls and 2 boys, take up photography, learning by trial and error, experience a rapid rise for prominence, exhibit and publish acclaimed work internationally, write for photographic magazines, experiment with early color photography, publish and sell work commercially, and still find time to make all the costumes and the backdrops which she used in her photographs, to tend her garden, where a lot of her photographs were made, to make extraordinary little snapshot albums filled with pictures and poetry for her children and grandchildren, and kind of run the household. I think she probably took the notion of multitasking to another dimension, really. By the time she died in 1938, her fame was such that in her obituary, F.J. Mortimer declared, and I quote, "This well-known lady photographer was producing some of her best-known work 20 or 30 years ago, and her pictures then had an originality of outlook and a brilliancy of treatment that was impressive. Some of her very early pictures of Madonna and child subjects are among the classics of photography." And you can see one of those here. So this is one of her very early child photographs. This was entered into an amateur photographic competition in the 1890s for the use of the bullet camera. One of her art photographs, a Madonna and child studies, which anybody who's seen the Cameron show will kind of see kind of resonance is there, but fascinating that this image wasn't only an art image, but it was also produced as a commercial postcard. Some of her early experiments with the autochrome process, moving into color photography. And on the right-hand side, this is members of her family using kind of Kodak cameras, and it's from the collection at the National Museum of Bradford, from the Kodak collection. So her work was used to advertise and promote photographic equipment and materials to the burgeoning market amongst women photographers in the early 20th century. Emma Barton produced most of her work in and around her various family homes on the outskirts of Birmingham, and then at Vernon Cottage on the Isle of Wight. Over the course of her career, her work evolved from simple snapshots of her children pasted into family albums and entered into amateur photography competitions, through to staged and directed romantic and mystical subjects, akin to the work of Julia Margaret Cameron, to highly crafted portraits which, as one contemporary writer suggested, and I quote, revealed the traceable influences which suggested that she first studied and then took hints and guidance from the priceless canvases of the great masters of chiaroscuro and composition. Using hand-painted backdrops, historical costumes, and primarily using her family and friends as subjects, she rose to prominence in the early 20th century in a manner said to have been, and I quote, almost meteoric in its rapidity and brilliance. Her work was awarded the highest honours in France as well as England and America, so much so that one leading commentator writing in 1912 suggested that her work was, and I quote, in the very top rank, along with people like Cazebeer, Derkoop, de Meyer, Steichen, de Marquis, and Puyot, and amongst the illustrious masters of perhaps that most difficult genre, portrait photography as an art form. In addition to her artistic work, Emma Barton also operated in what she once rather genteelly described as the lucrative side of photography. She sold exhibition prints, she copyrighted and licensed her work for commercial reproductions on postcards and greeting cards, and she allowed her name and her brand to be used to promote Kodak's equipment, materials and services. The research project that we did reached a conclusion when, on the 18th of February 1995, about 20 years ago, the renowned photojournalist Grace Robertson opened the exhibition Sunlight and Shadow, the photographs of Emma Barton at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. The exhibition was subsequently shown at the Royal Photographic Society in Bath in 1995-96, precisely 90 years after the Society had awarded Mrs. Barton with the honour of being the first woman to mount a so-called house exhibition, or a solo exhibition, or a one-man show, as it was described in one photographic journal. We also produced a catalogue, and there are a few copies left. You'd have to contact the library, Birmingham, to get them. But there is a catalogue that went with it. So we tried to make a kind of a permanent record of the work that we've done. The Birmingham exhibition afforded the perfect opportunity for a Barton family reunion. Descendants from Australia, Namibia, and Newcastle on Tyne assembled at the show and then visited Emma Barton's former home, Rosegate in Sutton Coldfield, the home where she created some of her most acclaimed images. A blue plaque marking the historical significance of the site was subsequently attached to the house by the Sutton Coldfield Municipal Society. And I'm delighted to say that 20 years after our last meeting, 3 of Emma Barton's great-granddaughters are here today, Ruth, Linda, and Lorraine. I don't know where you are. I said I wouldn't ask you to wave, but I will. Here. We had a really fascinating dinner last night, where lots of new information came out, and lots of things to kind of fill in. And needless to say, the gene pool is very strong. Linda is a practicing artist and photographer whose daughter, Lucy Emma, won a prize for her photography in a photography competition age 5. And Ruth is in the legal business, so all those traits kind of run through the family. Some years after the exhibition, Lorraine kindly deposited a collection of Emma Barton's photographs at the library, and then I deposited all my research notes and the correspondence for the project so that the photographs and all the research studies could then be accessed by others to do and take further research. So Emma Barton thus re-emerged from the shadows and was included in There Been Rose and Bloom's History of Women Photographers, which I saw the other day was in the 3rd edition. But she has remained unrepresented in other kind of non-gender specific histories of photography. So this is the photograph on the left is a photograph taken which includes Mrs. Barton standing in the window with members of her family surrounded on the front page of the Amateur Photographer, and on the right is the family group standing outside that same windows just on the right-hand side, kind of where she had her studio. I'd be the first to admit that despite the success of the project, I was all too aware that the exhibition and catalogue still only told a partial story, and there were any number of ways which the archive could and should be explored by others. In 2000, Laura Roach, then a student at the History of Art at Aberystwyth University, drawing on the archives at the library, added significant critical insight in her dissertation, Emma Barton, The Rediscovery of a Woman Photographer, in which she considered the cultural, social, and economic circumstances which framed Barton's work. Laura's work stemmed from an interest relating her own background as a Birmingham-born photographer, and her interest in, I quote, the difficulties that women faced then and the progression made by women over the century in professional photography. One of the major outcomes of the publicity surrounding the exhibition was the discovery or rediscovery of 130 previously unknown negatives, which turned up on the Isle of Wight. These, it turned out, were enlarged negatives made by commercial firms for printing Emma Barton's art photographs, made from her smaller negatives produced with her hand camera. Many of these related to known, the exhibited and published photographs, and others were totally unknown to us in the full sense of the word. And collectively, they offer the opportunity to shed a huge new light in her kind of practice and work. And this is just a kind of a full, small sample. And again, you can see, I think, the influence of kind of Cameron in here with the kind of Arthurian portrait, the kind of Idylls of the King, the Soul of the Rose picture on the right, which is very similar to Cameron's picture of a kind of girl in the garden, and the kind of the religious studies as well. It also gave us a good look inside her house, and what decorated her house, what the furniture was like, and how she arranged elements in her house to kind of create her studio. Having largely been off the radar for almost 20 years, the recent re-emergence and printing of these negatives prompted me to consider how, having reclaimed her rightful position in photographic history, Emma Barton had once again largely become invisible. So I began thinking about Laura's work and how we could create perhaps a new project to re-examine the archive, rekindle interest in Emma Barton's work, and bring fresh thinking and fresh insights to her work. And that's, in a sense, where Marta comes in. I first met Marta briefly at a portfolio day in 2014. Marta set up a studio in Birmingham's Jewellery Quarter with her partner Barbara Gibson a few years ago, and they quickly established themselves as the leading portrait studio in the city. Their recent commissions include work for the Birmingham Royal Ballet, which you can see here on the right-hand side. This is on show in the mailbox in Birmingham. If you do any Christmas shopping in the mailbox, go and see the show. And also for things like Intelligent Life magazine. In 2011, Marta was offered an opportunity to spearhead a large independent archival project for Annie Leibovitz in New York. She then joined Leibovitz's production team and assisted her on sets for shoots for Vogue and Vanity Fair. Marta's work has been shown in both group exhibitions and solo exhibitions at the Mall Galleries in London, Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, Midlands Art Centre, as well as Verge Art Brooklyn and Leslie and Lohman Museum in New York. She's received honourable mentions in both national and international photographic competitions such as Prix de la Photographie Paris and the International Aperture Awards. Her real passion is for portrait photography, but out of necessity, like so many commercial photographers, she also does fashion work and product photography to kind of pay the bread and butter bills. Talking recently about her work, Marta said, and I quote, "I was always truly moved and fascinated by strong and vivid female characters that made an impact and bravely represented women within photography and the arts. And of course, I always wanted to be one of them." So earlier this year, I had a conversation with Marta about trying to develop some form of collaboration with the archives of women photographers, which were held at the Library of Birmingham. And I began by showing Marta the work of three significant yet little-known Birmingham photographers. On the left, Liesl Haas, who was a German émigré photographer who worked in the German Illustrated Press, but also as a theatrical photographer in this country. Ruth Handley, who was an amateur photographer who had a studio at her home in Handsworth, who did a lot of kind of portrait photography, particularly theatrical photography for emerging stars of the theatre world. And then on the right-hand side, Emma Barton. Marta was almost immediately drawn to the work of Emma Barton, and she and Barbara have been visiting the archives and studying her work and the research notes as and when her commercial work permits over the last 9 months. And sadly, Marta can't be here today because of her professional commitments. When I spoke to her on Tuesday, she told me that she'd only had 1 day off in the last 5 weeks, which is possibly one of the lessons which we can teach young emerging photographers about how hard they're going to have to work. So what I want to do now is, because Marta can't be here, is allow her to speak to you about her work and her interests. If I can get this to work.
Hi, my name is Marta Kochanek. I'm a female photographer and I take photographs of people. I'm a Polish immigrant who lives in Birmingham, and it is where my photography studio is. My photography studio is where we are actually now. It is quite dark and atmospheric. I all painted in grey. But grey does not necessarily say anything about my nature. It says more about my style and aesthetic of photography. It is very fine arty. I am very much inspired by painters. It is quite moodish and darkish. I do like to play around lighting. The lighting needs to be precise. It's very important in my photography. And I would say it is all about light and the posture. I use old-fashioned props. All my backdrops are hand-painted. Our props are bought from the car booths, from charity shops. We also find some on eBay. Each thing that appears in my photographs is in purpose. I don't actually need to take 300 photographs and choose the correct 1 or 2 or 3. I try to be as perfect just to shoot like 6 photographs. Always there is a research in place. It is how I prepare myself. I then draw the frames I have in my mind. And obviously I'm then ready to invite anyone. So the test light is taken in advance as well. So I know what I am going for. What moves me about photography is the fact that you can immortalize moment that will never be repeated. There are plenty of things that inspires me. The fascination comes from love, of course, and also from my research, from reading books, from meeting talented people. I was always truly moved and fascinated by vivid and brave women that made a history of art and photography. To me, it is a great honor to be chosen to deliver work that would be exhibited along Emma Barton works. She's an important local figure. She was the first Birmingham-based female photographer to be taken seriously. I immediately fall in love in her Rembrandt-looking portraits. The whole idea is to set up an exhibition where old master and contemporary photography would be exhibited in one place. When Barton's work was introduced to me for the first time and I got the access to her archives, I was as excited as when I first entered Annie Leibovitz's archives. It is always a very exciting journey. It is about touching the history. It is about building respect towards their work. From this exhibition, what I would expect, obviously, to bring England's eye to Birmingham. What I love about Birmingham is the fact that it has its own character, style and history, of which Emma Barton was part of, and obviously I would like to be part of as well.
Thank you. The comments that Marta made during that film and in other conversations kind of really resonated, and early conversations really resonated with those made by Laura in her dissertation and wider issues I've been exploring in and around the library's photographic archives for over 20 years. Questions about how to animate photographers' archives to inspire, inform and enable up-and-coming generations of photographers to make and develop their work and their careers. So like all good projects, Marta Kochanek, as it's become known, having begun as a set of ideas and a conversation over a cup of coffee and exchange of knowledge, has quickly become an expanding universe which has drawn in a lot of richer and more complex thoughts and ambitions into its orbit. Before going on to talk about the project in particular, and its the ambitions and the opportunities I hope it presents, I want to quickly put the project into a slightly wider historical universe as part of the work that we undertook at the library around the photography archives over the last quarter of a century. This work has included exhibitions, commissions, research and curatorial projects which together have sought to acknowledge the contribution of women photographers in the history of photography, to address their absence from the archive, to challenge the notion of photographic archives as passive accumulations of material, to develop ways of making archives catalysts for new ideas and the creation of new work, and to initiate a kind of virtuous circle in which work made and inspired by engagements of the archive then become part of that archive, and in so doing offer themselves as touchstones or points of inspiration for future generations. Just kind of 4 examples here. A few years ago, we acquired a body of work by Anna, the top photographs by Helen Sweeting from an exhibition we commissioned called Home Hereafter. Faye Claridge's work on the right, The Child for Sacrifice, being deposited in the library, and Album 31, which was project we did through the Grain Photography Project, which was an exhibition in the library. So the question that arose in the midst of all these ideas and other initiatives was how to try and create and explore new ways of working with photographic archives, and to look at the work that photography archives can do. Looking through my Barton research files, I was reminded of an article that Emma wrote called On the Making of Photographic Pictures, published in Girls' Realm in 1904. Here she encouraged her young readers to take up photography by sharing the secrets of the most successful pictures and giving advice and practical tips on subject matter such as posing subjects, lighting and equipment. She expressed the hope and advice that advice conveyed might be, and I quote, a means of interesting them in the art of picture making with a camera, as distinct from mere snapshotting as practiced by most amateurs, reassuringly concluding that, and I quote, any intelligent girls who took up photography with the intention of becoming a picture maker instead of copying or imitating ordinary works had good reason for success. So what we're proposing to do is try and harness inspiration and information from these two individual stories of ambition, self-determination, application and achievement, and combine them possibly with practical knowledge and skills based on their professional work. I'll skip ahead a bit. So it's possibly a project which, in one sense, could draw on or end up kind of sharing some of the ambitions such as projects as Get It Out There, which is about to be initiated at the Photographers Gallery run by Lottie Davis, which aims to kind of prepare young photographers for a career in photography, but also to kind of look at the historical dimension as well. So there's a number of ways which I kind of thought we could kind of do this. We could look at the locations where Emma and Marta made her work. On the left is Marta's studio in Hockley, and Emma Barton's studio was clearly always in her home. This is kind of Rosegate again, where the family gathering was. So you could look at the locations of production for photography and how they articulated those spaces to make their work. You could always look at the equipment they used. Emma Barton never used anything more sophisticated than a handheld camera, sometimes put on top of a pile of books in lieu of a tripod to make her work. And so all her art photographs were made with a simple hand camera, whereas Marta clearly uses much more kind of complex technical kind of devices. But interestingly, where Emma Barton's using a simple hand camera to make very lavish pictures, Marta's using very complex equipment to make very pared back, simple pictures, so there's very fascinating contrasts there. To look at the way in which they both choose to pose their subjects. I think there's almost a kind of a language of kind of portrait photography, and a lot of younger kind of emerging photographers won't be aware of that kind of history of posing and kind of posture and all the kind of advice books that were generated around these. To look at the way they kind of controlled light in and outside their studio. The control of light was absolutely pivotal for both photographers. And there are other things that we can kind of draw on, kind of contemporary or historical records. This is from a series of articles on indoor portraiture, which were written by Maudie Draper and illustrated by Marion Silverstone, who was another Birmingham photographer who actually ran a commercial studio in the city. And I think it's fascinating to kind of look at can emerging students still learn something from the diagrams of photography studios that were published in 1905? I would suggest possibly yes. And there are other kind of really interesting elements, the use of hand-painted backdrops. The hand-painted backdrops that Marta used are plain, neutral colours. The hand-painted backdrops that Emma Barton used are reproductions or kind of copies of kind of arts and craft images, medieval and kind of Renaissance paintings. So there's one fabric which is used but could be used in very different ways to kind of create their images. You could also look at the way in which they talk about, write about and kind of promote their work. This is from a magazine from the Jewellery Quarter where Marta and Barbara are talking about her work, and this is from the photographer, and this is Emma Barton talking about my best picture and why I think so. You could also look at a lot of the literature from the late early 19th century, which was beginning to be generated for and steered towards kind of the emerging market in kind of women photographers. I was particularly taken by the one on the right, Ladies in Photography by a Mere Man, being self-referencing. And what was fascinating for me was that, so I think there's a kind of a whole project there we can kind of work out. I was really interested in the idea about Emma Barton being kind of lost in history. And then on Monday, I opened my copy of the Royal Photographic Society Journal, only to see this reproduction of St. Catherine, which we included in our original show 20 years ago, which is now in the big show on women photographers, which opened in Paris. So she's alive, she's well, and she's going to go on and generate interest in a whole new generation. Thank you very much.